Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes at 1:45. Okay, it is 1:45. I think we're ready to get started. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And Lila Haxton is joining me, CPD specialist in the State and Small Cities Division and headquarters. Lila, would you like to say hi?
Hello. Welcome, everyone.
All right. So it's Friday afternoon. I'm going to try to make this fun, end out the conference on a good note. Thank you for coming to the State CDBG-CV session. This is an addendum to your basically CDBG course, so it really is going to focus on things that are unique for states compared to entitlements, and especially things that are unique for CARES Act funding. You've met Lila. My name is Robert Peterson. I'm the director of the State and Small Cities Division. Let's get this started. So a little bit of housekeeping. This should be familiar from your other sessions. We are using Slido down below. You can turn on captions if you like. So Slido is that blue bar down below for Q&A. We have some support. If you do put information in the chat, we'll see that too. So it's more for technical assistance and volume issues. All right. But again, we're using Slido. If you're using it in an app, the code is 0001111. So 0001111. And you can access the chat in your Slido app. All right. So state CDBG. So again, like I said, we're going to focus on areas that are distinct for states from entitlements and also for CARES Act funding. So I know there's a lot of folks that are new to the program, and CARES Act funding is new to everybody. So you're in the right place. We're going to go over these 11 topics. We have 2 hours to do it. So if you're somebody like me who is constantly asking when the end of the presentation will be, we have these 11 sections to move through and to end our day. I have a device ringing at me I'll have to make that stop. All right. So in terms of the state program, the state obviously is the administrator of the program, but they're not the ones carrying out activities. So their offices are located in the state governments, and here's pictures of a few that I've personally been to. And you can see if you maybe recognize one of them. So kind of shout out to different offices that I've visited. Maybe you recognize some, maybe not. And what better for Friday afternoon than kind of an odd metaphor in a training session? And so the wind chime, right? So HUD is like the hook here. And it has this relationship with the state that means that we're passing a lot of responsibilities onto the state. It's the state that is a pass-through entity for the purpose of this program. It's the state that's ensuring compliance by the units of general local government that it funds, which in this case are like the bamboo, the state's the coconut. You're right, I said it, the state's the coconut. So, and the bamboo is the non-entitled units of general local government, which generally the rural parts and suburban parts of a state that aren't directly getting funded by HUD as entitlements. Now with CV funds, this got a little bit different. So there's the possibility that one of those wind chime pieces could be an entitlement. There's a possibility that it could be another piece that's a subrecipient of the state. It could be that the state is carrying out activities directly. So the sort of pass-through nature has changed a little bit with the addition of the CARES Act funding. But generally, the state has this relationship with the units of general local government that has certain limitations on it. They pass along certain requirements. The units of local government, they can contract and they can carry out activities directly as well. And the state's responsible for ensuring overall compliance with the program. And we'll talk about this throughout the presentation. It's important in the context of monitoring as well. When HUD monitors the state and there's a finding of noncompliance that was maybe committed by a unit of general local government or an UGLUG, HUD will issue a finding on the state for not having the proper compliance mechanisms in place to prevent that unit of general local government from going out of compliance. So like everything sort of trickles down through this relationship. And again, for CARES Act, we have options now for the states to act directly that they would never have in the regular program. They're only allowed to make awards and only to units of general local government in the annual program, which is very distinct from CARES Act funding. So the states and the UGLUGs have different responsibilities under the annual program. The state has a responsibility for all the planning. So that's a consolidated plan, affirmatively furthering fair housing, all the compliance issues for the whole program, setting priorities, setting funding. In addition, under the CARES Act, they wouldn't only be doing a method of distribution. We'll talk about what that means, but they'd also be carrying out activities directly, potentially. The unit of general local government, they have responsibility to really to the beneficiaries primarily. And what they're doing is they're planning and prioritizing what they're going to request funding for. They're setting up applications to address community needs. They are holding public hearings, and they're required to report up to the state. So in the annual program, again, the state is not allowed to directly carry out activities, but with CARES Act funding, they are. And in addition to administration, states are allowed to do technical assistance. And this is critical for, especially when they fund a small town with fewer resources, to help them, in some cases, to even help them with their application for funding to the state. All right. So in terms of administrative costs, this is also something that changed with the CARES Act, of course. For the annual program, we have a 20% of the funds received grant-based cap, as well as This is in 2 tiers, like the entitlement cap is at the 20% mark. But we also, under that, which is different from entitlements, we have a cap for just the state's admin and TA. So this is under the 20%. So some states will set this up in a way that they're giving units of general local government about 17% for their administration costs. And that leaves 3%, you know, kind of generalizing a little bit, but that leaves 3% for the state to carry out its administration and still stay under the 20%. So for states, technically it's 100,000 plus 3%. And the reason it's broken out like that is because that first 100,000 does not have to be matched. Additionally, TA funds that are drawn under the 3% do not have to be matched. But if they draw funds for admin under that 3%, then they do have to match those as well. Now for CARES Act, that's obviously changed a little bit. For CARES Act, we still have the 20%, but we also have a 7% state admin and TA cap. So it's an increased cap, and 5 of that's for the state's own admin costs. 2 of that is for technical assistance. Okay. All right. And I believe, Lila, you are up next.
Yeah, so I get to talk about plans, awards, and timing. Obviously, the Community Development Block Grant Program does have a plan requirement. We require that you complete a consolidated plan to assess your needs and assess, develop priorities on how you want to allocate the funds that are available to you to support different types of eligible activities. And the plan covers a multiple year period, but each year you'll prepare an annual action plan that will indicate your intention of how you're going to distribute the funds that are available to you that year. So we call that the method of distribution. As an attachment or in addition to your annual action plan, you'll also list the amount of funding, list the types of the local revolving funds and program income that are anticipated for that year as well. And that would be just a list that you attach to your plan. There are local kind of 2 levels. We'll talk about it a little bit later too, where there are 2 levels of citizen participation. So there'll be citizen, as a state, you'll have to have some public input, citizen participation in the development of the annual action plan. And the local, again, at the local level, they'll have to have some public participation, kind of reviewing their intent of what they're planning to submit to the state. So they'll have to have an opportunity for their public to comment on that. And then there are also some timely distribution requirements. So you'll have to notify HUD of how you're going to distribute your money, or what awards that you have made to distribute your money within 15 months of signing the FEMA state agreement. Next slide. It's a little bit more about the method of distribution. It is part of your annual action plan, and a little bit different than, you'll prepare it a little bit differently than you might see for entitlements. The state, you're going to identify specific priorities that you want to provide funding for. So you're going to have broad categories of funding instead of like identifying very specific projects in your plan. So you kind of have an idea of how you want to allocate the dollars, and you're going to discuss how you're going to distribute the money throughout your state. And we have a little picture of a state here. And so many states have entitlement communities that get direct funding allocations from HUD, and then the red, so that was probably, my guess is that's highlighted in the blue areas, and then the state gets an allocation to cover all those areas that are not covered by entitlement, and that's the red area. So your annual action plan really needs to address how you're going to spread the funding around to those red areas of the state. You have a lot of options. We don't necessarily HUD doesn't necessarily tell you how to do it. It's a choice on how you distribute funds, but you do have to announce your intention of how you're going to do that, and obviously you have the public or citizen participation to help inform how you're going to do that. But you could do it formula based, you could do it competitive, or you could choose like a regional fair share type of option. And yeah, I'll go to that side. But I just also for the coronavirus funds, there is a little bit different. You just give your funds to local governments, but there is an option, coronavirus, that you can just implement programs directly and include, in that case, some of your dollars under that program can go to entitlement communities, tribes, and private nonprofits, which isn't necessarily the case for the annual program. And so generally in the annual program, the state's not carrying out the activities directly, you're working through your local government. And so the next slide. This is kind of a community development block grant accomplishment and expenditures chart that kind of indicates where the past dollars have been spent, kind of shows some of the general categories that you might identify in your annual action plan about where you want to spend the money. So the green dots indicate the amount of money. So the larger the dot, the more money that has been going to that activity. So the primary for the state community development block grant funds, public facilities has been a popular item. Housing rehab looks pretty strong there. Also, you'll see in the red or the orange, it indicates the number of people that have been served. So you'll see the little circle, I think it's the food banks, but they serve 2.9 people, $2.9 million persons. And so for a little bit of dollars, they're serving a lot of people. However, that's, I don't know if it's counting meals or whatever, but you look at economic development, that is taking up a big, looks like it's a high priority for community development block grant funds from the state. And it only, at this point, generated 18,000 jobs. So yeah, it's a lot of money, but the impact is quite different. The impact of finding someone a job and employment it doesn't really compare to providing a meal to someone. So we have a diverse type of activities that tell different stories, and it's always a challenge to report out our performance. But essentially, I think we just wanted to highlight the different types of activities that can be funded under the community development block grant funds, and the state gets to choose how they spend those funds, based on the needs that they identify, needs and priorities they identify in the consolidated plan. So they get gets a choice, and obviously it's different on how each state can be come up with a unique plan for themselves.
Lila, I wanted to add one point. With CV funds, CARES Act funds, things are a little different. This is the annual program being shown in the graph. For CV funds, we see a lot less in terms of public facilities and housing, and quite a bit more for public services and economic development. So all people to stay in their jobs or create new jobs during the economic downturn, and public services as well, all that are tying back to coronavirus response and prevention. So just wanted to point that out. Ready for your next slide?
Yeah. So in the plan, I kind of touched a little bit about this earlier, but the locally held program income accounts, you do need to attach a list of these this funding source that's available. If your UGLUGs do have either program income or a revolving loan fund, make sure that you mention that and identify that as part of your annual action plan and kind of what is expected to be available. You just want to make sure that all available funding is visible and transparent. That said, not all states are going to have general units of general local government with program income. So, it may not be the case. It may not need to be reported. So I talked a little bit earlier too about citizen participation. It's very important that you provide an opportunity for the general public to comment on your program, both at the state level and at the local government level. And even further, we encourage you to try to do the appropriate outreach to your low and moderate income persons, with disabilities and limited English proficiency, to try to have a very broad and comprehensive citizen participation process, and whenever possible, try to target the beneficiaries of the funding to make sure that they have an adequate opportunity to provide input on the services that they might be using. So the state obviously starts first when they're preparing their plan, and they will need to have citizen participation opportunities to comment on the needs and the consolidated plan and the annual action plan. The local governments, once the state kind of announces what's available and what's available for eligible local governments to apply for, the local governments will have to hold some public hearings and provide an opportunity for their residents to provide I guess basically say, this is what our intent, this is what we intend to apply for, this is the amount that is available, the state's providing for us the amount that we're available to apply for. These are the types of eligible activities that are allowed that we could potentially use the funds for. This is what we think, based on our needs and the state needs, this is what we best think we should be applying for. They will have to indicate if any of the proposed activities would displace people, that are any activities that are being supported by the community block grant funds. And there's an opportunity, obviously they can file complaints. That's always part of the public comment process. If things are never static, and if things, the local government's intent changes, or they change, based on public input or circumstances, they have to change what they're asking for, what their intent to apply for, that, you have, again, provide opportunities for the public to comment on that. And then as a state, you need to make sure that you provide adequate technical assistance to low and moderate income representative groups. You want the groups that are serving the beneficiaries that are intended for community block grant funds. You want to make sure that they have the ability to apply for community block grant funding. So try to reach out and provide them some technical assistance so that they can apply for funds, effectively manage the program if they do get funds, and meet all the program requirements as well. So that's kind of a summary of all the different citizen participation requirements for the community block grant program.
Thanks, Lila. I think the next slide is mine. But before I jump to that, I just wanted to point out for coronavirus, especially for the pandemic, we've allowed for virtual hearings. So that's something to keep in mind. And I know folks have had to transition in a lot of cases from doing in-person hearings to doing virtual hearings and making sure that they're able to satisfy the requirements of the CV notice with regards to being able to conduct a virtual hearing in a way that the participants are able to see the questions that go up, the answers that come back, and definitely that's designed to encourage civic engagement, right? And otherwise, it would just be public comment if the comments just went one way. So to remind folks of that, and that's in effect for as long as public health officials advise in your local area. All right, moving on to pre-agreement costs. The rule of thumb here with pre-agreement costs is that if you're going to spend your own money to do an activity, especially as a local government, you want to make sure that the state agrees to that, right? And the state will need to have some policies and procedures in place to allow you to do that as a local government. Ultimately, any money that's spent that is going to later be reimbursed, the idea would be, and also too, just money spent on the same project in which other CDBG funds will go into in part or in whole, of course. The idea is that money that you're spending, you want to treat it as if CDBG rules already apply. So it's like you're spending CDBG money when you have an intention to involve CDBG later on, and also do pre-agreement costs where things you're going to reimburse against the grant, especially. So it means environmental review, it means citizen participation. So you need to be asking, on the previous slide, we talked about the public hearing related to the application from the local government to the state. Same thing with funds that you might spend yourself and treat as pre-agreement costs. So that's the general rule of thumb. With CARES Act, things obviously were a little unique. The CV notice talks about January 21st as like the earliest date that grantees would have been expected to incur pre-agreement costs. And that's based on the first confirmed case of coronavirus by the CDC in the United States, January 21st of 2020. So on here, timely distribution. Now, timely distribution is also unique for CARES Act. So let me talk about the annual program a little bit. For the annual program, the states don't follow the entitlement timeliness standards. And there are a lot of them. I'm sure states appreciate not having to follow the entitlement timeliness standards, not to jab against my colleagues or anything, but for the states, it's much simpler. We have a goal of we'll talk about that in a little bit, of achieving a balance against your grant of expenditures and moving the project forward and the program forward. So you're spending a grant every year. On the front end, though, we have a timely distribution requirement that entitlements don't have. And what this basically says is that as a pass-through entity, you have 15 months, the state has 15 months to make its awards to units of general local government. That's for the grant. And there's a form that's submitted to demonstrate that. And you can see that in the snippets there on the screen. With regards to program income and other amounts that might be deobligated later on and things like that, we do expect those amounts to be awarded expeditiously and expended. In some case, cash management rules apply. Now, timely distribution for a CARES Act is a little different. The 15-month requirement didn't apply. However, the states definitely do have to think about timeliness in the context of CARES Act, because there is a requirement to expend 80% by the end of the third year of the period of performance. And also the period of performance is shorter than with the annual grants, having been reduced to 6 years instead of 8. Don't forget. All right. So a little bit more about timely expenditure. So I mentioned that for states, it's unique. We just have a goal. Entitlements have a requirement of 1.5 that's measured 60 days before the end of the program year. How many more times grant do you have on balance? So for our program, because there's that additional 15 months up front that the state makes awards to local governments, there's a bit of a delay. So I have a longer, I guess, implementation phase. So the goal for states is different. It's 2.5, and it's a goal. We don't make findings against this. We do make findings against timely distribution, the 15-month requirement, but there's not a specific regulatory provision. It's always a concern of ours, but there's not a specific regulatory provision that states this as a requirement. It's stated as a goal. What you want to do, and what I like to look at the most, is the expenditure rate for a grantee, which is just 1 grant per year. The balance ratio will jump up and down. If you look at the graphics here, we see it, the blue bars, as you move through time, they pop up, and that's because a grant is being deposited in the account, so to speak. And then the balance gets slopes down. That's because over time there are draws that reduce that balance, and then it pops up again. That's because another grant got deposited. So for each grantee, these graphs look very different. Steeper slopes for faster expenditures and that type of thing. Our best case grantee, you can see their little bars, their balance of grants, it barely gets over 1.5. And this is a state. They would be passing the entitlements test, as a matter of fact. So it's in good shape. Whereas our worst case grantee, currently that particular grantee, you can see that their balance on hand rises as high as like 4.5 times their grant when they get the grant deposited. And by the end of the program year, they're drawing it down to about 3.5 times their grant. And then another grant's deposited. And you can see the red line now. You want that red line to be at least 1. So consistently being below 1, even at 90 or 80% of your grant per year, you're not going to ever catch up. So this is always an area we worry about, not just for any one particular grantee, but for the whole program. And that's what this is. So this goes back now. The last graph you saw just a couple bumps in the graph. It only went back 2 years. Now we got a lot of bumps in the graph, and that's going back as a national average for a decade, right? Or the past 12 years actually is what's included here. Maybe. No, I'm sorry. It is just a decade, 10 years. All right. So you see how it's not getting back down below 2.5. It's creeping up. This goes back pretty far. So some of our early spikes might have been, related to NSP expenditures. Our more recent spikes are definitely related to not just the addition of the CARES Act funding, but the fact that you've been dealing with a pandemic on top of doing your jobs. So I commend you all for the work you do, and for this not being worse than it could have been. That this graph could have really shown that we were really behind. But frankly, I'm glad I'm happy with where we're at. So I just want to thank everyone for just continuing to work through these conditions and pushing forward and being part of the response to the coronavirus. This is the graph against the annual program, and it's been going down over time a little bit, for sure. This is where we want it to be at 1. So the green line across there is spending 1 grant per year, and nationally for the program, it's been going down consistently. to a situation where our grantees are spending less than they're receiving in terms of like a rate per year. And that causes balances to increase, causes you to get behind. But like I said, there's a lot more money with CARES Act, and there's a lot more we need to do. And we've been rising to the challenge. So I really just want to appreciate everyone's work. Going on to eligible activities and national objective. This should be very similar to what you see in the entitlement program. However, our citations are going to be different for states. For the entitlement program, Part 570, so 24 CFR Part 570 has an extensive list of eligible activity criteria for entitlements. For states, it's not as long. We definitely have a little section in there, but for the majority of our eligible activities, we never brought a list over from the Housing and Community Development Act. So we still reference the Act for the majority of the eligible activities in the state CDBG program. So that's just important to keep in mind. Entitlement guidance, entitlement regulations regarding eligible activities are extremely useful for interpreting for interpreting the statute the same way HUD is interpreted, right? So it's a safe territory, so to speak, for states to use entitlement regulations as interpretatory guidance. A few distinct things you definitely want to keep in mind if you do that is that CBDOs aren't named that in the state program. They are named essentially a clunky name, which is 105 A.5.4 entities. Again, this is just the statutory reference for CBDOs. Entitlement regulations describe CBDOs and state regulations do not. So we just have the statute to refer to. Additionally, unlike entitlements, we do not have neighborhood revitalization strategy areas. We have community revitalization strategy areas that are essentially the same and provide the same benefits, but at a community level, designed for more rural settings. There is a eligible activity listed in the entitlement regulations that's kind of an interpretation of the statute that was provided by the entitlement division, and states can use that as interpretatory guidance. So it's interim assistance. You won't see it listed in the statute, but you can, as a state, use the entitlement interpretation and do interim assistance. And for the purpose of CARES Act, that's obviously increased to 6 months, up from 3 months. So, 105 A.5.4 entities. Again, these are similar to the CBDOs for entitlements. You have to really meet these two sort of criteria. You have to be the question is like, who do they have to be? What type of an entity? So there's the list: neighborhood-based nonprofit. There's 4 bullets. You have to be one of those. And then you also have to look at what you're doing. So what do they have to do? So you have to meet the criteria in both lists in order to qualify for the exceptions provided to 105 A.5.4 entities. And what those exceptions or allowances is that it can do new construction, which is a pretty big deal. They can retain program income and use it, and program income regulations don't apply. They can go above the 15% public service cap. There's no aggregate public benefit standard for economic development. So there are benefits to setting these things up in terms of regulatory allowances. So it's definitely something that through regulation we've encouraged. So the community revitalization strategy areas, these are similar to the entitlement neighborhood revitalization strategy areas. They have to be geographically targeted. The state has to choose to allow them. They have to set up the policies and procedures and their method of distribution to reflect that. But they can definitely do it if they want to. And if they do, there are some allowances that they receive again. So again, through statute and regulation, there are things that we're definitely encouraging. So In this case, if you were to focus your funding in this way, there's things you could take advantage of in terms of single family homes being called a single structure. It's kind of an odd way to explain that it creates an opportunity for you to do mixed income housing that otherwise wouldn't have been available. In terms of jobs, you can do a similar thing there as well. You can count jobs a little bit differently across the CRSA to allow you to do broader type of mixed income investment in a community. So on to national objectives. And I would say that the prior section, we talked about eligible activities. So that list of eligible activities for CARES Act was not altered. It was just added a tie back that whatever activity you do, it has to be to prevent, prepare, respond to coronavirus, what we call a tie back. In terms of national objectives, all of these national objectives can be used as well. There weren't any modifications to these for CARES Act. So basically the way this works, and this should look very similar to you from the entitlement program, it's all the same national objectives. And we talk about 70% of the funds having to go to LMI, and that can be done in 4 different ways: through area benefit, housing, clientele, jobs. That should all sound very, very familiar. Now with the CV notice for jobs, we did provide a different way that you could count that in your reporting to make it easier. So that's something to keep in mind. We have slum blight, urgent need. And again, you have to spend 70% of your funds for the LMI national objective. And the admin is like counted in the same proportion. So in effect, you can leave out admin from your calculation and just look at how much other funds you spend for activities. So for CARES Act, it's a separate standalone criteria of 70%. It's not mixed with the annual funds. And then the one thing that's kind of unique for states compared to entitlements is that states can do planning only activities. They can award a grant to a local government for the purpose of just planning for something that they aren't funding with CDBG yet. So that's an important distinction. Now, to talk a little bit about the area benefit method of demonstrating LMI benefits. So we want to show that the activities service area is benefiting a primarily residential area that is at least 51% low and moderate income residents. And grantees can do their own survey to show that we have data though that we encourage you to use. And it's provided in a few different geographies. And the idea is that you would try to find the geography that best matches your service area, depending on the type of activity you're doing. And it's important to keep in mind that these geographies look different in urban and rural settings. And this is a real difference between states and entitlements. So if you look at like the grayed out area, in an urban setting, the entitlement jurisdiction is grayed out. On the right, in the rural setting, that is the state's jurisdiction. So the whole area is the state. Now the thicker black lines, those are what we call census places, census designated places, cities, towns. That geography, in the case of an entitlement, the grantee area and the place geography are the same thing. In the case of the state, on the right, in the rural setting, there's all those units of general local government within the state's jurisdiction. And each of them is their own little place geography. Now, the finer gray lines, these are block groups, and these are really different between states and entitlements, especially very rural settings. They're very large. They're based on population. So you can see on the right, a single block group actually has like 5 different little towns in it. So if you were doing an area benefit activity in one of these towns, you would want to choose the place geography and not the block group. But on the left, in the urban setting, if you were doing like a water system improvement that only affected a couple neighborhoods, then the block group geography is better suited to line up to neighborhoods. So that's what you would use. So always keep that in mind. Ultimately in IDIS, you do enter this, and it doesn't let you put a place code in there. So you just have to enter the block group code, but you can put the data for the place. It's one of the many things we need to fix. And if you were on the IDIS session earlier today, thank you for submitting ideas. It was very helpful. Okay, moving on to, I think, my last slide before I pass it back to Lila on program income and revolving funds. If you were in the financial management session before this, you heard everyone talking about program income. I heard my deputy director, Corey, he was talking about definitely taking advantage of the provisions to limit the amount of funds are counted under the program income regulations. So you definitely don't have to count program income that's not defined as program income. So make sure you understand the definitions of program income. There is an opportunity for a state to create stricter requirements, but our requirements reference the amount of money coming in every year. If it's less than 35,000 per UGLUG or the state. For entitlements, it's 25,000, so that's different. If it's less than that, then we don't count it as program income. I won't go into too much detail about a lot of these different provisions. I do want to try to move things along and finish up in time. A big thing for states is that the program income can be allowed to be retained by the local government. They can even establish revolving funds. And if they do that, they're allowed to retain those funds for that specific purpose. And they don't have to draw them for any other purpose. Like, so if they have a housing rehab revolving loan fund and also happen to be doing an infrastructure activity, that town would not have to draw its program income from its housing revolving loan fund, that's CDBG funds. They wouldn't have to draw that to pay for the infrastructure activity. But if they had general program income available and they were funded to do infrastructure, they would have to draw that general program income ahead of that, assuming the rules apply. It's all CDBG funds, right? So keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Lila. I think we need to pick up our pace just a little bit in order to make it through and leave time for questions.
Okay.
So, over to you.
So I get the exciting topic of financial or fiscal controls and accounting. So the state must have documented written fiscal controls and accounting procedures. You can either use the ones that already exist if you don't have them. Hopefully all states do, but you can adopt new fiscal and administrative requirements, or you can adopt the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements for state and local governments. So you have the flexibility of adopting your own procedures or going with this uniform procedures and 2 CFR Part 200. You'll also have to manage the program income, fiscal controls for your program income and for your revolving loan funds. So the first bullet there, you need to distribute your program income to the maximum extent feasible before you request additional grant funds. The revolving loan funds are a dedicated fund and should be only dispersed for the identified activities that it's dedicated to, and shouldn't be used for activities outside of that are different from what the revolving loan fund was established for. And the last one is distribute repaid grant funds in the local account ahead of grant funds from the Treasury. Next one, procurement. So the procurement requirements in Part 2 CFR 200 allow the state to adopt their own procurement criteria. They could also adopt the criteria in the procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200. So you have an ability, the states have flexibility of adopting, controlling the policy and procedures for their procurement policies. So you have to follow the established, if you choose to go that route, you do have to follow whatever you've established as your procurement policy or procedure. You also have to ensure that your units of general local government follow procurement as well. You should make every effort to ensure that procurement is based on full and open competition, and ensure that you're controlling for conflict of interest. And have, I guess there are some exceptions related to conflict of interest, to make sure that you have a policy on how, if a conflict of interest is raised, how you will address it. So, so there's a common question that they put in here, and I'll try to address it. So the common question is, rural areas with few engineering and construction firms often ask about conflict when one firm helps develop the project requirements for procurement and the same firm also wins the bid. So obviously you need to, because you're a state entity, you're going to have to follow your state procurement policies and procedures regarding these requests. And you'll have to determine if your procedures let you do that or not. I think there are some opportunities when you look at the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements for local governments that you may be able to get to yes on this. It would require a lot of documentation. There are provisions in 2 CFR 200 for non-competitive procurement. That would be one option, is to look at the options for non-competitive procurement and see if they're this procurement would, like sole source, so if it met any of those requirements. If you go that route, and I know that conflict of interest is a concern, but if you go, a non-competitive route and procurement from a non-competitive process or procedures, there's still some data that you have to collect to make that determination that I think will help justify that you choose to move forward with that procurement. So you can request data. When the local government makes a request to you, you can request data. What was proposed? How many? How did you advertise? How broadly did you advertise the procurement? Did you ask why other vendors, why they didn't apply, or if there weren't any? What was your research to determine that there weren't any other available vendors? So you can get that information. They also should be providing you an independent cost estimate, so that you have something to compare the costs of the bid with what they expect the cost to be, so you can generally have a way to determine if the costs are reasonable. So if you're in this situation, reach out to your field office, and maybe or even your legal counsel, your other procurement subject matter experts, to see what might be available to you. Next slide. As part of a state, you're going to be in charge of monitoring your subrecipients, your local governments, and in the case of coronavirus, your entitlement communities, tribes, and maybe other state agencies. And it's a continual process. I mean, there's some standard things that you'll be getting, financial reports and performance reports. I think even before you make the award, you should evaluate the subrecipient to see, to figure out their capability, to see if there's any challenges ahead, and make appropriate, provide the appropriate training or add the appropriate conditions to the agreement. And you continue to touch base and reach out during the period of performance and close out. Use your financial and performance quarterly reports to figure out how things are going, and also if they're spending a lot of federal dollars, like over $750,000 in federal funds, they are required to do an audit, and you need to follow up. The audit would be reported to the clearinghouse, and you need to follow up on findings if there are any identified. And as part of your policies and procedures, think this through. What would happen if there's a deficiency? Think through your monitoring. Add that monitoring. Kind of build it into your everyday activities. How are you going to evaluate that kind of thing? If you standardize it, you'll remember to do it, I think. And then how are you going to deal with deficiencies? How are you going to give notice? How are you going to, what rubric or framework would you do to resolve that issue, or how heavy would you enforce that? And that all should be documented in your written procedures. 8. Oh, sorry. Next slide.
This back to me, right?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Lila. So I'm going to try to jump through this pretty quick. That way we have time for questions and discussion. CPD notice 2111 came out. It discusses how to do your performance and evaluation report as a state. So that's part of the CAPER. Now, for the longest time, we've had a PR 28 activity summary and financial summary that you are required to submit with your CAPER for your open grants. With CARES Act, we added the grant summary, and so it's another member of the PR 28 family, and that's a report that you run for your CARES Act funding, as well as for 19 and 20 annual funds in the case that you would have gone over your public service cap because you were doing activities that have tie back. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but I'm going to kind of go through each of these reports really quickly. So it's kind of a little quiz here. If you can look at this and see where you can make 3 compliance determinations, right? This is out of your PR 28 financial summary, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the answers. So you ready? Maybe you've already spotted them, but there are a few like caps and things in here. So let's check it out. So for admin, this is where you report your match. This particular report hasn't put any match. So that would be a fail when the field office reviews the grantee's submission. So as grantees, you want to make sure that that shows your match. And that's done on that adjustment screen before you go to the report module. You want to make sure that your admin expenditures are within the cap, right? So this is that 100,000 plus 3% cap, and also your public services down below. That's where you find all these. And again, this is outlined for you in CPD notice 21-11. Going on to the next page of the PR 28 financial summary. Here we have admin expenditures. This grantee did not exceed their 20% cap. Good job. Next page. Low income overall, low and moderate income benefit. This is on the last page of the PR 28. I will say that there's a little tricky thing about part 2 of this report. If the grantee does not put in that time period, then part 2 of the report will not appear. And when I say not appear, I don't mean it like shows up with zeros. I mean it literally is just not there. So keep in mind, grantees, when you set this up, make sure and put your years. This is, you can do up to You can do 1, 2, or 3 year period for overall benefit to meet 70%. You mark this thing as yes when it's time to close it out. This one's still in process. And then on line 77, I think it is there, you see it's 0.97. That's 97% spent for overall benefit. Again, the admin expenditures count in the same ratio. So if you recall, this grantee spent 17% on admin. That gets counted in the same ratio as the other expenditures. So we see 97% going towards low and moderate income benefit. All right. Now here is the new grant financial summary for the CARES Act funds. It is essentially the same report, except program income is not rolled into this thing. This is just the CV funds. And it also breaks it out. You can see for CV, everything needs to be drawn for coronavirus related activities. But you can also run this report for your 19 and 20 funds. And you can take a look at how much you spent for coronavirus related activities from those funds. Public service cap information is here. Again, this is going to be really useful for your 19 and 20 funds in determining whether you exceeded the public service cap for your non-coronavirus related expenditures. And on to applicable regulations and statutes. Off to you, Lila.
I guess to be quick, but this is just kind of a summary of all the statutes that apply to the program. That, you know, kind of a quick cheat sheet that but it starts out with the statute and some of the regulatory requirements in the left-hand column. So I don't know like how much detail you want because you want to get to questions, but it's the green box is kind of a summary of
sorry, Lila,
the eligible activities.
We might have more time for questions than
Oh, okay.
I thought. Do we go to 3:45? We do, don't we?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're in good shape. We're in good shape.
So yeah, so the first bullet here. Okay, so in the left-hand column, the first bullet is the Housing and Community Development Act, and then the bullets below are the regulatory requirements that apply to the program. There is a subpart I for states. There's part 91 for the comprehensive plan. And then after, so kind of with the hierarchy, then policy and guidance is the third set of documents that guides the program. So you can go to the HUD Exchange and find all the public notices that I'm sure you've heard about all week long. The green box kind of explains what Robert was talking about earlier about how to identify eligible activities with the state when you're not necessarily tied to the regulatory list of activities required for the entitlement unless you've adopted that. So these are some other documents that you can refer to look at the range of activities that are available to you. I guess the blue is the blue box on the right hand column. You know, if you want to learn more about rules and regulations, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Federal Register, but when a federal agency adopts regulation, they usually publish what their intent and provide an opportunity for public comment. And so there's like a preamble to any notice in the Federal Register, and it provides a lot of background information about why things are changed or, you know, adopted. And so that would give you a lot of background information as well. And the bottom part in brown, I don't know if Robert, you want to take this over, but this is the parts of Title 24 that apply to the state program. So we have our special subpart, that's the main part. And then there's some cross program requirements that you need to take a look at. And the bottom bullet obviously is one of the very important ones is record keeping. It's sort of in a unique place. I don't, Robert, if you wanted to speak to that, but.
Yeah, sure. I think in a unique place is kind of understating it. Yeah. So it's interesting. If you look in our regulation for record keeping requirements, what you'll see is mention of some external requirements that are agreed upon between HUD and the state, but it doesn't say what they are. It just says that they're going to be agreed upon between HUD and the states. Well, the regulation is right. There were record keeping requirements that were agreed upon. And where they can be found is in the back of the Guide to National Objectives and Eligible Activities. I think it's Appendix I. So it's uncommon to have like a guide that has sort of a regulatory tie in that sense, but that's where they are. The general sense here is that when you're in Part 570, all the entitlement stuff, like I mentioned before, can be used for interpretatory guidance for the state program. But where we have state-specific requirements, those are what need to be used. So everything in Subpart I, is really basically what applies to the state CDBG program. Not really anything else except for just these few that are listed, and that's it. So anytime we see a reference to 570.200 something, we know that that's an entitlement regulation, and it's probably not applicable to the state program, to be sure. So you always want to make sure that you're looking in the right place. Even things like our Guide to National Objectives and Eligible Activities, there are two versions. There's one for states and one for entitlements. Make sure you're looking at the right one. If you look at the longer, basically CDBG guidebooks that are available, again, there is a version that's just for states and a version for entitlement. So we always encourage states to make sure we're referencing the right requirements. All right, get you to your next slide here.
Yeah, so we touched base on several topics in 2 CFR 200, and I also did a presentation prior to this about 2 CFR 200, like when OMB adopted the regulations or published the 2 CFR Part 200 regulations, it says in there at the kind of introductory parts of the language that federal, so these are, I have to back up a little bit. 2 CFR Part 200 is the unified requirements for all federal awards. And OMB requires federal agencies to follow these uniform requirements, except when program statutes or program regulations vary or differ. And so then those kind of we have to follow those over what a 2 CFR 200 requirement is. So some cases we have to look at both, and we try to make sure that we comply with both requirements as much as possible. But in some cases, you're not going to follow a provision into CFR 200 because there is a regulation or a statute for our program that you need to follow instead. So the first column here kind of identifies this kind of on a high level of what we follow, and then what there's exceptions to that you need to kind of figure out what applies into CFR 200 and what where you need to look at program regulations. So definitions are as applicable, and like Title 24, Part 2 CFR 200 has subparts as well. So the definitions is applicable, the general provisions is applicable. For pre-award, this is where we diverge a little bit with the 2 CFR 200 requirements, and this is where the state can adopt their own pre-award activities, or you can choose to adopt to align with 2 CFR 200. It's the state's ability the state has a prerogative to choose which way they want to go based on some regulatory requirements that we have on the books. The same is applied to Part D, the post-federal award requirements. Again, the state has an option to adopt or have their own set of requirements. The cost principles apply. There are a few minor exceptions, but for the most part, you have to follow the cost principles, make sure that your costs are reasonable, allowable, and allocable. And then there's some specific the cost principles. There's a few kind of items that are just flat out not allowed, like entertainment or alcohol. And then there's some other guidelines like salaries and stuff like that, guidelines on how the federal government or you would determine those are reasonable. So that is something we follow. There's also a variation on allocability. Normally you would normally when you manage multiple fiscal years, grant programs for multiple fiscal years, you need that maybe have multiple year period of performances like we do. You know, when you have an expense, you should have a financial system that ties it to the right subaward under the right fiscal year, so that the activities have to be distinct and aligned with how the awards are made. The one flexibility that we have is for grants management that I guess you guys can that grant funds, state community development grant funds can be used to pay planning and program administrative costs associated with any other state community development grants. So there can be a little less alignment for that type of activity, for planning and admin activities. And finally, subpart F, you do have to follow the audit requirements. And then on the right-hand side, there are a lot of cross-cutting activities. Some of these are cross-cutting requirements. Some of these requirements apply to all federal awards, and some are kind of HUD-related requirements. So environmental review, that's required for all federal awards. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, lead-based paint, relocation and real property, those are kind of HUD based requirements. So you can see the list there. We just recently issued a memo on notice on section 3. So those are kind of a listing of all the other requirements that you need to be familiar with when you're carrying out your community block grant plan. Oh yes, closeouts, my favorite. So we wanted to explain the difference between closeout and cancellation. Closeout is when you have notified HUD, the state has notified HUD that you've completed all the activities under the award. All the activities that you complete are eligible and have met all our program requirements. There's no money left in your bank account, and if you haven't used all the funds, you've returned what you haven't used. And that all the problems, all the monitoring findings, have been addressed, and you're ready to officially close out that account for the books. And there's a process that you follow to do that, and that process is outlined in CPD Notice 1402, and that kind of outlines the financial performance and other documents that you need to submit to officially close out the award. And closeout shouldn't be confused. We also have this term called cancellation. So FEMA will automatically cancel your account at the end of the 8th fiscal year, which counts the year of your appropriation as year 1. So this goes back to when the appropriations is based on appropriation law. So when the appropriations are made, we have a requirement that the funds are available for 8 years. And so, so that's why we quote unquote cancel the account after 8 years. Just because the account is canceled and there's no money in the account anymore does not mean that it's closed out. You still need to follow the procedures that are outlined in the CPD notice, and it's important to make sure that you fully complete that closeout. There are a lot of closeouts, very old, for a lot of older awards that are floating out there. We've been working, I think the field offices have been continually working to try to close out those older older awards. And there's a memo or some direction related to that process as well. And if you have any older awards that need to be closed out, I'd recommend that you reach out to your field office to find a path forward to get those officially off the books.
Thank you, Lila. I'm going to take the next slide, but before I jump off of this slide, I just wanted to point out that everybody had a lot of work to do, or a lot of grantees had a lot of work to do to prevent 2014 funds from canceling at the end of last fiscal year, back in September of 2021. And we appreciate that. That was the last of the grants that were accounted for using the first in, first out accounting. So over the years, like, the balances kind of rolled forward, and there was a fair balance there that needed to be addressed to avoid cancellation. And Lila, could you mute your mic? Thanks. So this year, the 2015 accounts are going to cancel at the end of this fiscal year. And we are preparing some guidance that'll go out similar to last year. Encourage folks to do what they can to prevent the 2015 funds from being lost, because once those accounts cancel at the end of the fiscal year, those funds are no longer available for any form of obligation expenditure. It doesn't matter if you obligated it to an activity, it's no longer going to be in your account, because there will no longer be an account. It'll be canceled. So we encourage you to work through that. If you have a 108 loan, not many states do, but that's an easy way to spend down these remaining balances, is to make payments against your 108 using those funds, assuming they're unobligated. So you may have to, with slower moving activities, you may have to obligate newer funding to those, and older funding that may be at risk of expiring. Move those funds instead to an activity that can draw them down quickly. So something that needs funds now. There's faster moving activities, things that just happen to need funding now. It would be a good idea to swap those funds around so that you can draw down those balances. So we'll be getting some guidance out, also to help you be able to determine which activities still have remaining balances from your 2015 grants. So that's not always easy to see in the system. So we'll give you guys out through your field offices. We'll be providing some information on that. So moving on. I'll keep in mind too, CARES Act, it's only 6 years, not 8. All right. So
this is kind of a summary here of all the differences that we've kind of alluded to throughout the presentation with regards to CARES Act. The biggest by far is that states really took a huge role, and that was recognized in the way that the formula was set up as well. So there were 3 rounds of funding. The first reflected the annual program formula. There was a second round of funding basically for states, and a third round of funding, which was based on coronavirus related data. And ultimately, the states received a larger portion of the overall appropriation than they would have normally under just the annual formula. And it was more money too. It was $5 billion overall instead of a little over 3. And that was in addition to the $3 billion that we've received annually in 2020. So a lot more money coming through, and a lot more opportunities to do different things and establish different partnerships. The biggest thing was that states were allowed to act directly. So we have seen states entering into interagency agreements and working with unique partners, working with county health departments, essentially more engaged in funding of activities directly. There's a set aside, however, I should mention. So the method of distribution is not completely off the table. There is a set aside that discusses how units of general local government are to be involved in the state program, including under the CARES Act. The amount equal to CV1, so it doesn't have to be just like round 1 funds. It's all one grant, so you can't really tell the difference if it's 1, 2, or 3 funding. It's all part of one grant. So it's an amount equal to CV1, has to be for a unit of general local government use. And we've published some Q&A to better explain that. It can get pretty nuanced pretty quickly, as some states have been exploring different options. But the idea is that that amount equal to CV1 still has to be for a unit of general local government use. And if the state is partnering in that use, that's okay. And I encourage you to refer to our Q&A documents for more information about any sort of creative program design options that the state may be considering. Additionally, unlike the annual program, which is sort of separate from the ICDBG program, which has funding for Native American populations, CARES Act did not have that allocation in the approach. So we opened it up so that states can also fund Native American groups as well. So it's opened the door to other parts of the state that the state wouldn't normally work in. So traditionally, they just worked in the non-entitlement areas. And now they can even work with entitlements under the CARES Act. So the state can carry out activities in entitlement areas as well. And when they do that, they can even use, if that entitlement happens to have the exception criteria to be able to use less than 51% as a standard for area benefit, the state can also use that in that same jurisdiction if that's where they're carrying out their activities. Other things that are unique for CARES Act are the elimination of the state admin match. Again, I mentioned that you can see on the right in orangish letters, it's a little bit of a different cap. But again, in the annual program, it was 100,000 plus 3%. 100,000 does not have to be matched. TA doesn't have to be matched, but admin does. So any portion of that 3% that's expended for admin would have to be matched by the state. That's not the case for CARES Act. CARES Act, you can use 7%, 5% admin, 2% TA, no match. it's 20 overall. So the remaining 13% can be for a unit of general local government administrative costs, subrecipient administrative costs. Procurement hasn't changed too much. Under the CV notice, though, you will see that in the annual program, procurement done by the state is typically only done in the context of the state's administration. Because remember, they can administer the award. They can use that 100,000 plus 3% to do administration things, and they could hire administration contractors. But now they're allowed to carry out activities directly. So they're not limited to only making awards to units of general local government anymore. There's things about procurement now that they may need to establish standards. The state may need to establish standards for itself related to its own procurement for this purpose. So it's discussed in the CV notice, but it's not any sort of major alternative requirement. It's just that states are working a little bit differently, and those procurement requirements are expanded to cover that. Record keeping for CV. There's a little bit of a caveat there as well. There are record keeping requirements, of course, for CV. But what is different from the annual program is with regards to LMI benefit in the form of jobs. And I'm sure you've heard this during the other sessions during the week, there's an allowance for counting jobs as created and retained and documented by using the income of the job, as opposed to collecting income documentation from the person that's hired. And again, the biggest thing is that CARES Act funding has to be used for activities that have tieback, that are to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. And we have lots of guides that we've published and Q&A pieces and things to really sort of give you ideas for what types of activities could have tieback and what tieback could look like. There's things you have to keep in mind, like, for example, with economic development, the pandemic has caused a general economic downturn, and economic development activities are considered to be in response to that. So when you're funding economic development, you don't necessarily have to fund a business that was directly impacted by the pandemic. Funding new businesses that are in response to economic downturn, where there's new opportunities being explored and new jobs being created to make up for jobs that were lost, and that's being used as the justification. And then you can have tieback. You can have this criteria met that it's in response to coronavirus. So I want to keep that in mind. Use those resources and review those materials. Let's see, what do we have in the next slide here? It's just a review of everything that we've gone over. I think we are a little bit ahead of schedule. We're going to have plenty of time for public comment. Public comment for questions and comments. But just to review, we've talked about state administration, the structure of the program. We had a wind chime showing that it's the state that has to make awards to the units of general local government, and it's those towns and cities that are carrying out the program. And that changed with CARES Act. We have the states acting directly, also funding different types of partners than before. We talked about the plans and awards and timing. States have a method of distribution that's unique from entitlements. They have timeliness standards that are unique from entitlements. They have a 15-month requirement to make their distribution of their awards. Not applicable to CARES Act funding, but it's definitely unique from entitlements. We talked about eligible activities, national objectives. Again, very similar to the entitlement program, but make sure you're looking to the right requirement. We go back to the statute. You can use the entitlement regulation as a state for interpretive guidance. We talked about number 4, program income and revolving loan funds. Cash on hand principles apply there, if you recall. We have a definition of program income that you should know well to know what qualifies as program income and what doesn't. For states, whether or not local governments are allowed to retain program income or whether they're required to return it to the state is one of the biggest questions that we get. We also get questions about whether revolving loan funds can be dissolved. I didn't mention this when I was on that slide, but I thought I'd mention it now. Stagnant economic development revolving loan funds. They can be reprogrammed. Those funds can be essentially deobligated from that budgetary purpose of a revolving loan fund for economic development if they're not working, right? If there's no interest in that loan program and there's an interest in putting those annual funds towards something else like infrastructure, that can happen. I think there's been an urban legend out there that once the program income was in that revolving account and dedicated to that purpose, that it's true that it's to be used for that purpose. But that doesn't mean that the fund could not be ever dissolved and those funds reprogrammed. We've had a number of states that have found themselves in that situation. It's mostly related to interest rates and businesses that weren't interested in following the federal requirements that have caused those funds to become stagnant over time, but not all. And there's definitely, especially now with CARES Act and a different approach and different economic situations, there are definitely ways to make it work again, but those funds can be reprogrammed. We talked about fiscal controls and accounting. Part 200 came up for states. Not all of Part 200 immediately applies. There are some caveats, so always keep that in mind. We talked about procurement. Again, states are establishing their own policies and procedures there. States can offer exemptions for conflict of interest, something that's not found in the entitlement program. We talked about subrecipient monitoring. This is a huge thing for states. A lot of states run a risk analysis process just like HUD does to determine which of those towns and cities they are going to monitor and make sure that those local governments are carrying out the activities in compliance, that they're holding their required public hearings. Number 8, we talked about reporting. Again, there's a new member of the PR28 family of reports. That's the grant financial summary, breaks out your coronavirus related expenditures. Use that for your CV grant. And also if you did public services related to coronavirus out of your 19 and 20 annual grants. We talked about the applicable regulations and statutes in the 9th section. Again, the big takeaway there, make sure you're looking in the right place. So we have, especially regarding Part 570, the entitlements have a longer list of activities than we do. In terms of interpretory guidance, we go back to the statute. So you definitely want to make sure you're looking in the right location when referencing our regulations. Item 10, we talked about closeouts and cancellations. 2015 is going to cancel this year in September. September 23rd is the last day to submit your approved vouchers. So, there's 2 levels of approval for those vouchers. Any obligated funds that aren't spent by that time will also be canceled. So just because it's obligated doesn't protect it. The account is going to go away. So make sure you're attending to your 2015 funds, and we'll be issuing some assistance related documents for you. And then we just talked about throughout, and with the last slide, we talked about differences with CARES Act. The biggest of which, like I said before, is that states can act directly, but they still have a set aside for local government use. Okay. All right. So I think we are ready to move to questions. I don't know, Lila, if you wanted, do you have Slido up? Would you like to read through the questions and I'll maybe take a shot at them?
So for pre-agreement, this will be for you, but for pre-agreement costs, does the environmental review for UGLUGs need to be completed prior to the execution of the grant agreement, or should it be completed once the award notification is made, but the grant agreement is still being created?
Oh, I think we scrolled down. Oh, okay, there it is. That was a question from Zach. Thank you. No, it's a good question. So again, when you do anything with pre-agreement, you want to, you are spending money before you have your grant, in essence. Treat that money like it's CDBG funds. So you have to do the environmental review. The same requirements apply. You are getting your grant later on, yes, but the environmental review has to be done upfront if you have the anticipation of reimbursing those expenditures from your grant once you get it. All right. Next question.
There is talk about extending the deadline of 80% of funds being used for community development block grant CV due to the chain of supply delay.
Well, I feel your pain. So the 80% comes from the statute. So unless you hear of something from Congress in terms of some amendments being proposed to that, that would be news to us as well. So unfortunately, the requirement is there, and we encourage you to work towards meeting the requirement. HUD does have flexibility in our corrective actions in terms of what we'll do if there's non-compliance with that requirement. However, like I said, it is in the statute, so we do take it seriously.
So then next question, can community development block grant money be used for background checks for volunteers involved with youth or senior programs? I don't know if you, from a 2 CFR 200 point of view, you need to define, you need to build your case for this. The has to be reasonable and allowable. So for reasonable, you might need to look at the activity that the background checks are tied to. So if it's just general background checks for any nonprofit agency, probably not. But maybe if it's you're running a tutoring community funds are used for a tutoring program, and volunteers are part of that tutoring program, you're getting closer to saying that it's a necessary and reasonable expense for that activity. And Robert, are there any community development block grant requirements that come into play here?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you that this probably falls into the realm of an administration or an operation cost. But I will point out, related to public services, that probably one of the trickier requirements in our regulations relates to the fact that those services have to be new or a quantifiable increase to the service, right? So keep that in mind. All right, next question.
So I thought states had their own procurement and conflict of interest regulations, And the ones in 2 CFR 200, 320 only applied to the entitlement program. And yes, that is correct. The states have their own procurement or can adopt their own procurement requirements. However, local governments do have to follow, which are your subrecipients essentially, they do have to follow the 2 CFR Part 200 procurement requirements. And so in some cases, when you look at the requirements for local governments, in some cases, they need to seek approval from the state to do certain things. And so when they come, or to the state grant, in this case, the grantee or pass-through entity. So when they come to you, you'll have to review it and approve it. And when you review it and approve it, you'll have to look at your procurement guidelines to see how you would review that request.
Okay, so just to add on to that, in terms of the state's own procurement requirements and the procurement requirements that the state sets for its units of general local government,
Yes.
that's discussed at 574, 24, 24 CFR 570, 489. Talks about program administration and procurement, conflict of interest. And you're right, it references the state's own requirements, gives them a few options. States may adopt Part 200 for that purpose if they wish, but that is just one of the options available.
So the last one we have here is, this may have already been stated, but if an UGLUG has program income and has 2 activities, that program income can be directed to one specific activity, or does the program income need to be used first, regardless of the activity of the eligible cost is originating?
So the cash management principle here is that you want to expend your program income before your draws from Treasury to the maximum extent feasible. Right. So to the maximum extent feasible, we've had conversations with states about, you know, how much kind of leeway does that give you, so to speak. At the end of the day, you're not really going to have to like be on the fly so fast as to know that, like, okay, a program income deposit just happened 5 minutes ago, so that's what I have to use to make this draw. I doubt your accounting systems can accommodate that, right? With that said, yes, you would use the program income for whatever the draw is that's being requested. Whatever that request for funds is, you're going to fill those requests for funds that are coming in using your program income before you use your grant funds. So it requires you to be a little bit on the fly in terms of funding for activities. So if you attended the IDIS session, you saw that when you have an activity that's funded with grant funds and there are program income funds available, you are given those program income funds as an option to draw from instead of the grant funds. And if you do that, IDIS will flop the funding around for you. So it'll reduce the amount of grant funding, increase the amount of program income funding for that activity so that you can cover that cost from your program income funds. Another thing to keep in mind is that even though the program income piece is not happening in IDIS, it needs to be reported in IDIS. So grant funds, you have to go to IDIS, you have to submit a voucher, or they will not show up in your account. Program income is the other way around. Program income is already in your account, and you're reporting up, the local government's reporting up to the state, or the state's reporting up to HUD on what the balance is that they've been received. They're also reporting up what they're being used for, and submitting vouchers against that as a form of reporting the transactions that are occurring in your own accounting, right? So it's very distinct from grant funds in that regard. So you do have to keep it up to date.
but you know, so we try to make IDIS as friendly as possible in terms of that fungibility of funds. So, do we have another question up above? Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
Any other questions in the? Let's see, I haven't been doing a good job of minding the brand live chat. Take a look in there. Let's see. No, I don't see any questions there. I see a few questions that weren't thrown up on the screen. One, does the 3% for states also apply to program income received? Yes. So the state can use the program income receipts for that year to determine a cap of funds that can be used for admin. So yeah, having program income come in does increase your cap on your 100,000 and your 3%. So it's based on the amount of program income received in the year. But keep in mind, under 35,000 received by the state or received by a unit of general local government separately, under $35,000 is not program income. So it's not until it exceeds $35,000 that all of it's considered program income. So some states manage that requirement by tracking program income receipts. And once they've exceeded $35,000, then they'll dedicate them to some purpose for the program. If they don't exceed $35,000, then they're written off as miscellaneous income, right? So it's an important consideration to keep in mind, and even design your program around to make sure you're not receiving more than that amount if that's what you wish. There was another comment. It's not really a question, but there was a comment that said this. They said, given our annual allocation, the 100,000 plus 3% admin TA cap means our state has to administer the CDBG program, conduct statewide outreach to our state's 200 non-entitlement UGLUGs, and provide oversight TA for many very low capacity communities with only around 4% of our allocation. We have heard similar comments from probably from all the states by now, that they would like to see an increase in that cap. Again, that is a statutory cap. So in terms of us at HUD, we are limited. But we were happy to see that Congress recognized that concern when the CARES Act was issued, that you provided a larger amount of money that did not have to be matched. So your concerns are being heard. However, like I said, it is statutory, so we do have a very limited ability to do anything different until Congress tells us otherwise. So let's see. That's the last. Is that the last of the questions then, I think?
There's no more questions in Slido.
Okay. I think I was looking at a different Slido number.
Oh, maybe the other. Okay.
Yeah. I think in the chat there was I might have been looking at the wrong session Slido, but glad to know we had all the questions taken care of and then some. So I just answered one from the other session. So I want to thank everybody for attending our session. We can give you back 15 minutes. Let me really quick check your agenda and when you should be coming back. Too many windows open here. Yeah, so you have a break until 4 o'clock. when you'll see the session co-managing CDBG-CV and DR funds at 4 to 5, followed by, this is Eastern time, followed by a session on monitoring from 5 to 6. So again, I want to thank you all for joining our session, and especially thank you all for the work that you do, for stepping up to the challenge and being part of our nation's response to this pandemic. I know it's been hard on all of us as individuals and families, and you know, the encouraging thing, though, I think for me personally, is knowing that we're part of the response, that we're providing needed help to people. And I want you all to know that your work is highly appreciated, not just by us, but definitely by the people that you serve. And I know you probably don't get enough thanks in your jobs, but I definitely wanted to express my heartfelt gratitude to everything that you've been doing. So I guess we can end the session there. Thank you all.